Biodiversity means different life forms. This term pulls together all the organisms that live in a particular environment and the relationships they forge amongst themselves and with the unliving part of the ecosystem. An ecosystem with a low biodiversity is therefore made up of few species. This system can cope with natural changes, whether they are climatic or man-made, for example pollution, but when disturbed, it is unlikely to return to its initial state. A system with a high biodiversity, on the other hand, has a very good chance of returning to its initial state if disturbed. Therefore, for the same level of disturbance, the consequences are more serious for environments with a low biodiversity. The preservation of life is in fact often linked to the ability to maintain a high biodiversity, and one of humanity's most important challenges is that of increasing knowledge of the infinite number of ways in which this occurs in order to understand the past as well as to foresee the future of our planet. On the subject of biodiversity, the Mediterranean basin could be considered a reservoir of biodiversity of inestimable value. Our sea is home to a great number of species, both boreal and tropical, and witness to numerous survival strategies which the various groups of organisms put into practice to adapt to such a changeable environment as the Mediterranean. We shall begin our journey on the Ligurian Sea, starting from the area where land meets the sea, where the characteristics of both environments overlap. Here, sudden changes in environmental conditions strongly affect the way of life. As a result of the enormous alterations that the Ligurian coast has experienced in the last century, first with the construction of the coastal railway lines and then the erection of buildings, today there is hardly a trace of the blanket of vegetation that once existed. Very few plants have survived on the beaches. Some of the typical species, such as the yellow poppy and the convolvulus sondanella, which creeps in the sand, are nothing but a memory. The coastal vegetation has the Mediterranean hallmark. It includes often aromatic plants such as thaya, myrtle, holm oak, strawberry trees and lentisk. On the rocky terraces, which stand 20 to 30 meters above sea level, you can find plants that are wind and salt resistant. These populations survive between the cracks in the rocks, where humus is often formed, and maybe where they are sheltered by large rocky spikes and protected from the southwesterly wind and the Scirocco gale. These inaccessible cliffs represent one of the most interesting botanical environments in our province, a real refuge for numerous Mediterranean species which can no longer be found elsewhere. Broom, or Ginestra, can be found all along the Ligurian coast, as well as sea fennel, which you can find on all our cliffs and much closer to the sea, almost deliberately catching its prey. Finally, we meet different kinds of exotic plants, such as the prickly pear and the agave, which are now well integrated in the coastal environment. The Portofino promontory, jewel of our province, as well as being a regional park, is a classical example of the spectacular nature of the coastal environment and has the typical atmosphere of a Mediterranean marquee. The various environments that you meet descending towards the bottom of the sea are distinguishable by the communities of organisms that live in them. At the points of the cliff or on the beach where the first salty sprays of the sea land, live the organisms which originate from the sea, but nonetheless survive and remain in contact with the sea only through the small amounts of water brought up by the wind and the waves, above all in the winter and spring. Only a few species manage to adapt to this hostile environment, which, when you examine the rocky area, stretches as far as the heights reached by the sprays of the waves when the sea is rough. Lichen, such as the Xanthoria parietina, and other seaweeds live here, penetrating the rocks, rendering them porous and increasing water retention, essential for the organisms that live together in this environment. Seaweed residue is an ideal form of nourishment for some animals, such as the sea snail, Litorino neritoides, the isbod, Ligia italica, and the ceripede, Chitamalus depressus, which are typical examples of the animal population. The latter are crustaceans which are immobile, attached to the substrate, and protected by a cone-shaped calcaneous armor round a limp body. They are often called dog's teeth, like the borers that live on the rocks, covered by water. Once you pass through the area, catching the sprays from the sea, you reach the environment within the confines of the tide, which in Liguria is limited to about 30 centimeters. The populations found here are conditioned by the movement of the waves, since they are alternately submerged and then exposed. Ligurian beaches are, for the most part, pebbly, and the area which marks the confines of the tide is therefore inhabited by very unstable populations, usually in the summer and autumn, such as seaweed and small crustaceans, which live on the organic material brought to shore during the high tide. Annelids and many bivalves, on the other hand, can be found buried in the sand at various depths on the few sandy beaches that exist. The muddy beaches, which typically lie at the mouths of watercourses, once home to lush land vegetation, rush and thin cane, which represent a characteristic confine between land and sea, have almost disappeared. A lot of seasonal seaweed is attached to the section of the cliff which is exposed during the low tide. Moreover, host to many characteristic living organisms. A sort of belt of heavily calcified seaweed is formed where the sea motion has greater effect, producing a whitish colored pavement which is very characteristic and plays a fundamental part in protecting the waterline from the destructive and erosive effects of the sea motion. One of the animal species that is typical of this environment is the sea snail. However, the most well-known, common and most characteristic animal of the area, which marks that high and low tide, is undoubtedly the crab, which is represented by several species. You can find wells or small natural reservoirs of water in the cliffs in this area, formed between the rocks during the high tide. The flora and fauna that colonize these areas are forms highly specialized in enduring drastic changes in ecological conditions. The mere fact that summer insulation, which favors evaporation, creates high temperatures and brings salt to the wells is reason enough. Sudden storms, on the other hand, cause an abrupt decrease in these figures. The area marking the confines of the tide is particularly sensitive to pollution, above all hydrocarbons, which float on the surface of the water and cover the area very easily, causing serious damage. Let's now go slowly underwater in the luminous world found just a few meters down. This is the undisputed domain of seaweed, a multicolored underwater garden, a miniature forest, where the rocks wear mantles swarming with life. Seaweed can be found up to a depth of 40 to 50 meters, according to the light penetration and the variability of the substrate. The cliffs and boulders which have collapsed, commonplace along the Ligurian coast, for the first few meters are covered by a thick carpet of seaweed, composed of a great variety of A good look through the rock ravines is sufficient to recognize a multitude of other types of animal organisms. Beyond a depth of 15 to 20 meters, the effects of the sea motion are less insistent and the light is dimmer. You begin to find seaweed which exploit the dim light of the environment, large sponges and spectacular gorgonias which host a great number of species between their spectacular branches. When the seafloor is sandy, you will find one of the most characteristic environments of the Mediterranean, the oceanic Posidonia prairie. The Posidonia, which is wrongly considered to be a type of seaweed, is in reality a surprisingly superior plant which reproduces itself flowering and bearing fruit and has the typical appearance of land plants, as it has a stem, leaves, and roots. It can be found on the surface and up to a depth of 30 to 40 meters, or better so, where light can reach it, forming proper underwater prairies. This vegetable takes the uttermost advantage of the sunlight, producing large quantities of oxygen thanks to its considerable leaf consistency. Its leafy fronds are home to and protect many larval forms of fish, which are valued for human consumption. A multitude of other kinds of living organisms feed and multiply among the green leaves of this plant, which, apart from its biological actions, also represents a physical defense mechanism for our coasts. Its leafy mass is able to naturally reduce the force of the sea motion, therefore limiting the erosive effects on the coastline. Water pollution and the dumping of materials which build up and suffocate the prairie are mortal enemies of this environment, which should be protected and safeguarded. Since the 1960s, the Ligurian Posidonia prairies have decreased in number. Practically a third of the underwater forests have been lost in less than 50 years. In the sandy areas that lack vegetation, you will find mainly animals, shellfish, worms, which bury themselves in the sand and live in the upper layers of the substrate, accompanied by crustaceans, starfish, holoturia, and fish, which all have the typical traits of organisms which colonize a substrate of this genre. Naturally, you will not find seaweed in the areas which do not get sunlight. Here, the environment is evenly colored bluey-gray. However, if it is illuminated by artificial light, the animals reveal a kaleidoscope of colors. These organisms often have arborescent shapes in order to optimize the possibility of capturing food transported by the currents. On the subject of animal life, a fundamental part is played by all the organisms which swim freely either near the coast or in the open sea. The Mediterranean waters, and the Ligurian Sea even more so, are waters with a considerable amount of nutrients, and consequently represent the potential basis for a food chain capable of supporting not only the big pelagic fish, but also various species of large sea mammals, which is the reason for proclaiming our sea a sanctuary for cetaceans. The high biodiversity of the Ligurian Sea, therefore, should urge us to preserve and safeguard this invaluable wealth that we all have in common. New ways of furthering knowledge of biodiversity need to be found. We need to study the animals in their natural habitat, to breed them, to understand their biological cycle, and the reasons why they have a particular shape. We should try to discover their number, how they are distributed, and their interaction with other species. Very often, humans are superficial with regards to the delicate natural mechanisms that exist. We forget who we are and where we come from. Today, we know that our species, Homo sapiens, is a result of an increase in biodiversity on our planet. At this moment in time, the planet is experiencing a slow but relentless reversal of this trend. The human population is rapidly increasing, whilst the phenomenon that we have defined biodiversity is drastically weakening. The easy, immediate advantages gained from exploiting the biosphere are provoking dangerous consequences, which we can understand by reading about the mechanism which, in ecology, explains the intimate relationship between the predator and the prey. The increase in the human predator will only cause a decrease in the species of the prey. This should make us think seriously about committing ourselves to safeguarding biodiversity.